Shout out to Tim Hardaway. He was on Gilbert Arenas' podcast, Gil's Arena, and he was setting these dudes straight because they keep on having these debates where they kept on saying stuff like it was just Michael Jordan and just a bunch of dudes in the 90s and the 80s. I don't know where this thing came from as far as like disrespect of like older folks. I think it's been like this for the past 15 years or so, a little bit, maybe a little bit older. The thing about Bird, Magic, Jordan, Isaiah Thomas, Shaq, Kobe, like there was such a reverence to older players. Like I think like Magic Johnson wanted to be like Earl to Pearl Monroe. Like you would never hear these guys, Jordan, any of them, disrespect Bill Russell or Wilt Chamberlain, because the league that those guys played in is totally different than what Bird and Magic and Jordan had to play in. But they would never disrespect those guys. So it's always funny to me when I watch Gil's show or some of these other shows, and it just, oh yeah, they played against a bunch of plumbers. And it's like, this is ridiculous. So Tim was on there, and Gilbert was like, no, I wasn't talking about the 90s. I was talking about the 80s. No, you wasn't. Shout out to Tim Hardaway. They had NBA All-Star Weekend, and they have a Legends brunch, and they had Run TMC. They had they had Tim Hardaway, Mitch Richmond, and Chris Mullin, Run TMC. You know, the thing about Golden State winning with Steph Curry and Draymond Green and those guys and Klay Thompson is that people forget about Run TMC, and Run TMC was great. I mean, they were the original version of that, but they as the years go along, they don't get their due. But Tim mentioned somebody that I loved as a player because I'm here in Ohio. He mentioned Mark Price. No one mentions Mark Price. And I guess Gilbert was trying to say, Gilbert was asking the question, if hand checking was so great, how is it possible that Tim Hardaway was able to kind of break the hand checking and do the crossover and all that stuff? And he was saying, well, because I was fast, I was quick. Because he made a comparison between him and Derek Harper. Derek Harper was a skilled player with the Dallas Mavericks and then later played with the Knicks. But he wasn't necessarily fast, but just a really good ball player. But Tim Hardaway was twitchy. And he mentioned a couple other players that was twitchy, and one of those people was Mark Price. And I love this because no one brings up Mark Price. Listen, I think we all agree that Steph Curry is one of the greatest, if not the greatest shooter, ever. But if you look at Steph Curry's game, it's very much like Mark Price. Mark Price was that same type of dude. And Tim was saying it like Mark Price would bring the ball up and stop on a dime and shoot a three without even thinking about it. And the crazy thing about Mark Price was Mark Price looked like a youth pastor. he like just an unassuming dude that you just meet at Walmart and say, hey, how you doing today? That's what he looked like. But he was an assassin. And he came in that Cleveland draft. It was Brad Daugherty. I think it was the 85 or 86 draft. No, Howard Williams came in 85 draft. It was the 86 draft. Brad Daugherty was number one. So Cleveland drafted him number one. They bought a pick and got Ron Harper out of Miami of Ohio with the 8th pick. And in the second round, they got Mark Price. Mark Price was a second rounder. And he was I think out of Georgia Tech. And he was just a pure shooter, but because he was so small, they had to make him to a point guard. And he became an excellent point guard. And the craziest thing about those Cavs teams, they drafted Kevin Johnson, and Kevin Johnson was Mark Price's backup. And Tim Hardaway mentioned Kevin Johnson too. So Kevin Johnson was Mark Price's backup, but they traded him for Larry Nance. I think they traded Mark West and Kevin Johnson and somebody else for Larry Nance. That's how great that Cavs team was. And the crazier thing is that team also had Dale Curry. If we talk about Steph, that team had Dale Curry. And Dale, he played behind Ron Harper. Like as great as Ron was so good. I hated it when they traded Ron Harper for Danny Ferry. I hated that trade because it killed their chances. But Dale Curry was so good, but he was behind Ron. And then they also had Craig Hilo. So when the Hornets had the expansion draft, that was the Hornets and the Heat. They exposed, because you only keep a number of players, they had to expose Dale Curry. And I think maybe they felt like they weren't going to take Dale, but the Hornets took Dale. And they took Dale, and then Dale became a star with the Hornets. Steph Curry was born in Akron, but then he was a baby, and they all went down to Charlotte. And that's, from that point, it was Dell and Steph and Steph just learning how to shoot from their dad. So when these guys, on Gil's show are always talking about like, oh, they didn't play against anybody, blah, blah, blah. Even Swaggy P, like Gil, Tim Hardaway called out Swaggy P because Swaggy averaged like 17, 18 points, but Swaggy, I don't think if he was in those leagues back in the 90s, Swaggy probably would have been the 10th, 11th, 12th man on that bench. Those guys, they just weren't physical back in the 80s and 90s. They were mental. You had to have a strong mental game back then. If you look at let's take Alonzo Mourning. Alonzo Mourning is great, one of the greatest players ever for the Heat and also for the Hornets when he was with Larry Johnson. Dennis Rodman and some of those dudes back in the day, they used to get into his head. As talented as Alonzo Mourning was, they knew maybe they couldn't out physical him because Alonzo was very physical, but they got into his mental. Like you could break him really fast. You could frustrate him really fast. That was a tough, man. These guys talking all this trash about the 80s and the 90s players have no idea how physical it was because you could do hand checking. You could hit dudes in the throat. Rick Mahorn elbowed Mark Price in the head. And I think it was just a foul. That's how tough that league was. But it just wasn't, it was mental. Look at interviews from Kobe and Kevin Garnett and Allen Iverson and Shaq, and they will tell you how tough it was when they came into the league. It was not easy. The reason you saw when Kevin Garnett won and Shaq and Kobe won, when you saw them win in the 2000s, there's a certain toughness about them. And even though Allen Iverson didn't win, there was a toughness about him as well because they played in an era where those guys were older, but they can still hit you in the throat. It was and these guys were coming in, 18 years old. So you got these teenagers going up against dudes where there was hand checking and they can hit you. You got someone like Tim Hardaway. He can check you up. Gary Payton, Sean Kemp. What are you going to do with them? And again, let's get over the fact that Jordan played against some plumbers. You get that. There's a bunch of teams that had great players who never won from the 80s. You had that Seattle Sonics team with Xavier McDaniel and Detlef Schrempf and Dale Ellis. Later over in Portland, you had the Clyde Drexler's team with Terry Porter. Who else came for the 80s? You had that Atlanta Hawks team with Dominique Wilkins and Doc Rivers and Kevin Willis. You still always had those Knicks teams. Even the Jordan teams that didn't win the championship, it was Jordan and Charles Oakley on that team. And then later you had Oakley with Patrick Ewing and Mark Jackson. And again, you got the Indiana teams with Reggie Miller. And then you got my Cleveland team with Brad Daugherty, Mark Price, Hot Rod Williams, and Ron Harper. And then you had my Cleveland's team with Brad Daugherty, Mark Price, Larry Nance, and Hot Rod Williams. Those teams, you had those Milwaukee teams that was good. You had the Seattle's teams with Gary Payton and Sean Kemp. Nah, the Dallas teams with Mark Aguirre, Ronaldo Blackman, and Derek Harper. So I will never understand the disrespect these younger dudes have for those teams. It's like they don't do their research, and maybe that, and then, you know what? Maybe that's just life, man. Maybe that's how the world is today. There's a lot of disrespecting of men, especially like black men, over the past 20 years or so. And just because of how the family dynamic has changed, I think that's filtered in with some of these criticisms. Because I would never disrespect, man. If I disrespected my grandfather or my uncle or just older person in general that I wasn't even related to, man, I would not only just catch it in front of those older folks, I would catch it at home for being disrespectful. Now, I know Gilbert and all those guys, I mean, I don't think they mean any malice, but I don't think they know their history. Now, Tim was fair. He said he felt like Gilbert could have played in that era. Yeah. But I think they would have also played mind games with Gilbert too. And punch him in the throat.